Ground staff stay on the service side of the fence, sir. The words echoed across the busy operations yard and immediately drew the attention of several nearby employees. Marcus Reed stopped walking and turned toward the voice. The 52-year-old black businessman stood near the entrance of a major logistics hub outside Atlanta. Cargo vehicles moved through marked lanes. Freight containers were being loaded onto aircraft. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in shipments passed through the facility every hour. Marcus looked around calmly before meeting the eyes of the woman who had spoken. Emily Parker, the operations manager, stood with a clipboard in one hand and a radio attached to her belt. Her expression suggested she had already decided exactly who Marcus was. "I am sorry," Marcus said politely. "Were you speaking to me?" Emily nodded. "Yes. Employee access routes are on the other side of the building." Marcus glanced toward the area she indicated. Several ground crew members in reflective safety vests were entering a service corridor. He looked back at Emily. "I see." Emily crossed her arms. "Visitors are not allowed in this section unless they have authorization." Marcus smiled slightly. "That sounds reasonable." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. Most people responded defensively when challenged. Marcus simply listened. Around them, a few workers slowed their pace to observe the exchange. One employee pushing a cargo cart glanced over his shoulder. Another paused near a loading platform. Marcus noticed the attention but remained completely relaxed. "May I ask what brought you to the conclusion that I work on the ground crew?" he asked. Emily looked him up and down. Marcus wore dark slacks, comfortable work shoes, and a lightweight black jacket instead of a business suit. Earlier that morning, he had toured several facilities and chosen comfort over formality. "Because you are standing in a restricted operations area without a visitor escort," Emily replied. "And because executives do not usually arrive dressed like that." A few nearby employees laughed quietly. Marcus nodded as though considering the point seriously. "Interesting observation." Emily checked her watch. "Sir, I am very busy today. If you are looking for employment services, Human Resources is located across the property." The laughter grew slightly louder. Marcus remained calm. "Thank you for the information." What surprised everyone was that he did not move. Instead, he slowly turned his attention toward the operations floor. Massive digital displays tracked incoming shipments. Trucks arrived at loading bays. Workers scanned inventory. Aircraft schedules updated in real time. Marcus studied the activity with remarkable focus. Emily noticed. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus replied. "Very clearly." "Then why are you still standing here?" Marcus pointed toward one of the large displays. "Because something seems unusual." Emily frowned. "What?" Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly. The screen showed shipment volumes, routing schedules, and processing times. Most people would see numbers. Marcus saw patterns. Years of leading billion-dollar logistics investments had trained him to notice details others missed. "Perhaps nothing," he said. "I could be mistaken." Emily sighed. "Sir, this is exactly why unauthorized personnel cannot wander through operations zones." Marcus smiled. "You may be right." Yet he continued watching the display. Something felt off. He could not explain it yet. Not completely. But several numbers appeared inconsistent with what he expected from a facility of this size. Emily shook her head and spoke into her radio. "Security, I may need assistance near Operations Gate 3. Several workers exchanged looks. The situation was becoming entertaining for them. To Emily, it seemed obvious. An unfamiliar man had wandered into a restricted area and refused to leave. To Marcus, however, something far more interesting was unfolding. The numbers on the screen continued updating. Every few seconds, new information appeared. Every update strengthened the uneasy feeling growing in the back of his mind. He looked toward the loading area again, then toward the aircraft schedule, then back to the display. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the facility was overlooking a serious problem. And while everyone around him remained focused on who they thought he was, nobody seemed to notice the issue hiding in plain sight. Marcus Reed continued studying the operations display while Emily Parker waited for security to respond. Around them, forklifts moved between loading zones and cargo teams followed their schedules without noticing the concern growing in Marcus's mind. The large screen refreshed again. Shipment counts updated. Transit times shifted. Route assignments changed. Marcus focused on a specific section near the bottom of the display. The numbers still did not make sense. Emily followed his gaze. What exactly are you looking at? She asked. Marcus pointed toward the screen. That column. Emily glanced at it briefly. Those are outbound routing assignments. I assumed so, Marcus replied. Do you review them often? Emily folded her arms. Every day. Marcus nodded. Then perhaps you can help me understand something. A few nearby employees continued listening. The situation had become more interesting than their normal routine. Emily sighed. Go ahead. Marcus pointed again. Why are shipments assigned to Gate 12 showing departure times that overlap with freight already scheduled through Gate 9? Emily looked at the screen. Because the system balances traffic automatically. Marcus nodded slowly. Normally, yes. Emily frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Marcus kept his eyes on the display. It means those assignments appear to be competing for the same loading window. Emily immediately shook her head. That is impossible. Marcus smiled politely. It would certainly be a problem if it were true. Several employees exchanged looks. Emily stepped closer to the screen and reviewed the data herself. At first, everything appeared normal. Then she noticed something unusual. A small inconsistency. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to catch her attention. She quickly dismissed it. The system would flag any conflict. Marcus nodded. Usually. Emily looked irritated. You seem very confident for someone who does not work here. Marcus laughed softly. That is fair. Before she could respond, another update appeared on the screen. The numbers shifted again. This time Marcus immediately spotted a second inconsistency. His expression remained calm, but his concern grew. He had spent decades building logistics companies, evaluating transportation networks, and auditing complex operations. Certain patterns were difficult for him to ignore. The more he observed, the clearer the issue became. Emily noticed his focus. You still think something is wrong? Marcus answered honestly. I think something deserves a closer look. Security personnel finally approached from across the operations floor. Two uniformed officers walked toward the group. Several employees expected the conversation to end immediately. Emily gestured toward Marcus. This gentleman entered a restricted area and has been refusing to leave. Marcus looked at her. Refusing is a strong word. One of the officers smiled slightly. Sir, do you have authorization to be here? Marcus reached into his jacket and produced an access badge. The officer accepted it and examined the credential. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked at the badge again, then at Marcus, then back at the badge. Emily noticed. Is there a problem? The officer hesitated. No problem. He handed the credential back respectfully. Everything appears valid. Emily blinked. Valid? Yes. The officer nodded. Completely valid. Marcus placed the badge back into his jacket. He did not elaborate. He did not explain. He simply returned his attention to the display. Emily stared at him. The situation was becoming increasingly confusing. If he was not an employee, why did he possess authorization? If he was authorized, why had nobody informed her? More importantly, why did he seem more interested in the operational data than in defending himself? Marcus watched another update appear on the screen. This time the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. His eyes narrowed slightly. What began as a suspicion was quickly becoming certainty. Somewhere inside the facility, a process was producing incorrect routing decisions. And if he was reading the data correctly, the consequences could become very expensive within the next few hours. While everyone else remained focused on who Marcus Reed was, Marcus was becoming focused on a much more important question. How long had the problem been hiding in plain sight before someone finally noticed it? Marcus Reed continued studying the operations display while activity flowed around him. Trucks arrived at loading bays. Cargo containers moved across the facility. Employees followed schedules generated by the system without realizing that Marcus was no longer observing the people. He was observing the data. The more he watched, the clearer the pattern became. What initially appeared to be a small inconsistency was spreading across multiple routing assignments. Every refresh revealed another mismatch. Every update suggested the same possibility. The facility's automated routing process was directing shipments into overlapping schedules that could eventually create a serious operational failure. Emily Parker noticed that Marcus had not moved from the display. She walked toward him again. You are still looking at that? Marcus nodded. Yes. You really think you found something our operations team missed? Marcus smiled politely. I think the data found something. I simply noticed it. Emily shook her head. Our system processes thousands of shipments every hour. That is exactly why I am paying attention, Marcus replied. Nearby employees exchanged looks. Some were beginning to find his confidence irritating. Others were becoming curious. Jason Turner, the facility's logistics director, happened to be passing through the operations floor when he noticed the gathering crowd. He slowed his pace and approached. What is going on here? Emily immediately answered. Nothing serious. Marcus looked toward Jason. Perhaps. Jason glanced at the display. Perhaps what? Marcus pointed towards several routing assignments. These shipments are competing for the same processing window. Jason frowned. That should not happen. I agree, Marcus replied. Jason stepped closer to the display. Unlike Emily, he spent most of his career analyzing logistics systems. He reviewed the information carefully. At first, everything seemed normal. Then he noticed one of the assignments Marcus had highlighted. His expression changed slightly. Interesting. Emily crossed her arms. You see something? Jason did not answer immediately. He reviewed another section. Then another. The silence made Emily uncomfortable. Jason. He pointed toward the screen. This routing sequence should not exist. Marcus nodded. That was my conclusion as well. Emily stared at both men. Are you saying there is actually a problem? Jason hesitated. I am saying I need more information. He pulled out a tablet and opened internal reports. Employees nearby slowly returned to work, but many continued watching from a distance. The situation had evolved from an argument about access permissions into a discussion about operations. Marcus folded his hands behind his back and waited. Jason compared multiple reports. The longer he reviewed the data, the more concerned he appeared. This is strange, he said quietly. Emily looked between them. What exactly is strange? Jason turned the tablet toward her. These shipments should have been distributed across different departure windows. Emily studied the information. Could it be a reporting delay? Jason shook his head. Not across this many routes. Marcus pointed toward another section of the display. Look there. Jason followed his finger. His eyes widened slightly. Another inconsistency had appeared. Then another. Suddenly the issue was no longer isolated. It was spreading across multiple departments. Emily felt her confidence begin to weaken. The stranger she had mistaken for ground staff was identifying problems faster than the people responsible for managing them. Jason looked at Marcus carefully. How long have you been watching this? About 20 minutes, Marcus replied. Jason stared at him. 20 minutes. That was all it had taken. 20 minutes for an unfamiliar visitor to notice something that internal teams had overlooked. Jason immediately contacted his analytics department. Run a verification on outbound routing assignments from the last 6 hours, he instructed. The response came quickly. Several minutes later, his tablet displayed preliminary findings. Jason read the report once. Then he read it again. Emily watched his face. What did they find? Jason slowly lowered the tablet. The system is generating conflicts. Complete silence followed. The issue Marcus identified was real. And if the report was correct, the problem had already begun affecting hundreds of shipments. For the first time that afternoon, Emily stopped wondering who Marcus Reed was. Instead, she began wondering how he had seen what everyone else had missed. The silence following Jason Turner's announcement felt heavier than the noise of the entire facility. Employees continued moving shipments across loading zones, unaware that the system directing their work had begun generating conflicts. Jason stared at the tablet in his hand. The preliminary analysis confirmed what Marcus Reed had noticed almost immediately. Routing assignments were colliding. Departure windows were overlapping. Processing schedules were competing for the same resources. The issue was no longer theoretical. It was real. Emily Parker looked from the screen to Marcus and back again. Earlier that afternoon, she had been convinced he was an unauthorized worker standing in the wrong place. Now he was standing beside the logistics director discussing a problem that internal systems had failed to identify. How bad is it? Emily asked. Jason reviewed the report again. We do not know yet. Marcus folded his arms. The answer depends on how long it has been happening. Jason nodded. Exactly. Emily felt a growing sense of concern. Can we isolate the affected routes? Jason immediately contacted the analytics department again. Several minutes later, additional data appeared on his tablet. His expression tightened. This is worse than I expected. Marcus remained calm. How many routes? Jason looked up. More than 20. Emily blinked. 20. And that is only what we have confirmed so far. Around them, Supervisors began noticing the unusual gathering near the operations display. A few approached to ask questions. Others simply watched. News traveled quickly inside large facilities. Within minutes, people understood that management was investigating a system issue. Nobody yet understood how serious it might become. Marcus stepped closer to the display. The numbers continued updating in real time. Every refresh added more evidence. He pointed toward a sequence of outbound shipments scheduled over the next 3 hours. There, Jason followed his finger. What do you see? Marcus studied the data carefully. The conflict is spreading. Jason's eyes widened. He immediately compared the live display to the report on his tablet. Marcus was right. Additional assignments were beginning to shift into the same pattern. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Why would the system do that? Jason shook his head. We need a technical review. Marcus remained focused on the display. The technical explanation matters, but not as much as the operational impact. Jason looked at him. What are you thinking? Marcus pointed toward a cluster of shipment routes. If these assignments continue stacking on top of each other, the facility will eventually create bottlenecks at multiple loading zones. Jason reviewed the information again. The realization hit him immediately. Delays, misrouted freight, missed departures, customer complaints, contract penalties. The financial consequences alone could be enormous. Emily looked toward Marcus. You figured all of that out from the display? Marcus smiled slightly. The display was trying to tell everyone. Most people were simply looking somewhere else. The comment landed harder than he intended. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what he meant. For nearly half an hour, everyone had been focused on questioning who Marcus was instead of listening to what he was saying. Jason suddenly received another message from the analytics team. He opened it immediately. The color drained from his face. What is it? Emily asked. Jason looked up slowly. The issue is affecting facilities beyond Atlanta. Complete silence followed. Marcus nodded as though he had expected the answer. Jason continued reading. The same routing algorithm was deployed across multiple hubs this morning. Emily stared at him. You mean this problem is not local? Jason shook his head. No, Marcus looked back toward the operations display. The situation had just changed completely. What appeared to be a single facility problem was rapidly becoming a network-wide failure. Employees continued working around them. Trucks continued arriving. Aircraft continued preparing for departure. Everything appeared normal on the surface. Yet beneath that appearance, a growing operational crisis was spreading through the system. Jason looked at Marcus carefully. If your assessment is correct, we need to act fast. Marcus did not answer immediately. He watched the display update once more. Then he looked directly at Jason. Fast may no longer be enough. Jason Turner stared at the latest report while the operations floor continued moving around them. The facility appeared normal to anyone passing through. Freight was being loaded. Schedules were advancing. Trucks were arriving on time. Yet beneath that appearance, a growing problem was quietly spreading through the network. Emily Parker looked from Jason to Marcus Reed. Tell me exactly what happens if this continues. Jason opened another report and reviewed the projections. Before he could answer, Marcus spoke calmly. The system will keep optimizing for efficiency based on incorrect assumptions. Emily frowned. Meaning? Marcus pointed toward the display. It will continue redirecting shipments into routes that appear available on paper, but are already approaching capacity in reality. Jason nodded. That creates congestion. Marcus continued. Then delays. Then missed transfers. Then rerouting costs. Emily felt her concern deepen. How much could that cost? Jason looked at the numbers and exhaled slowly. Potentially millions of dollars if multiple hubs are affected. Several supervisors who had gathered nearby exchanged worried glances. The atmosphere around the operations center was changing. What began as curiosity was becoming concern. Marcus continued watching the live data. Another update appeared. His eyes immediately focused on a section near the center of the display. There it is again. Jason stepped closer. What? Marcus pointed toward a sequence of outbound transfers. The algorithm is not only creating conflicts, it is multiplying them. Jason examined the information and immediately understood. The routing system was responding to its own mistakes by generating additional adjustments. Each correction created new conflicts elsewhere. The problem was feeding itself. Emily shook her head. How did this get through testing? Jason looked at her. That is the question everyone will be asking. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. The more important question is what happens next. Jason knew exactly what he meant. Every minute that passed allowed the system to create more routing assignments. More assignments meant more conflicts. More conflicts meant larger consequences. Emily looked at the display. Can we isolate the update? Jason nodded slowly. Possibly. Possibly, she asked. Jason looked uneasy. The update was deployed across multiple facilities simultaneously. Rolling it back is not a simple process. Marcus folded his arms. Then continuing operations while investigating may not be the safest option. The statement immediately caught everyone's attention. Emily stared at him. Are you suggesting we stop operations? Marcus did not answer immediately. He studied the display one more time. Another conflict appeared. Then another. The evidence continued growing. Jason looked increasingly concerned. If we stop operations, every facility manager in the network will demand an explanation. Marcus nodded. And if you do not stop operations, they may eventually demand a much larger explanation. Silence followed. Nobody liked the answer because nobody could argue with it. Emily looked around the operations floor. Hundreds of employees were working. Aircraft schedules were active. Shipments worth enormous amounts of money were moving through the system. The idea of stopping any part of it felt unthinkable. Yet the data on the display continued telling the same story. Jason's phone suddenly rang. He answered immediately. As he listened, his expression changed. The caller was from another hub. Then a second call appeared. Then a third message arrived. Reports were beginning to come in from other facilities. Similar issues. Similar routing conflicts. Similar confusion. Jason lowered the phone slowly and looked directly at Marcus Reed. For the first time that afternoon, there was no skepticism in his voice. You were right. Marcus simply nodded. But inside the operations center, a much bigger decision was rapidly approaching. Jason Turner's confirmation changed everything. The conversations around the operations center became quieter. Supervisors stopped speculating and started paying attention. The issue was no longer a possibility. Multiple facilities were now reporting the same pattern. Routing conflicts, schedule collisions, processing delays. The problem was spreading through the network exactly as Marcus Reed had predicted. Jason stood near the display reviewing incoming reports from regional hubs. Every few minutes another message appeared. Every update confirmed the same troubling reality. Emily Parker watched the growing stream of alerts and felt the weight of the situation settling across the room. Employees who had been casually observing now listened carefully. Nobody was laughing anymore. Marcus remained calm. He stood several feet from the display, studying the information as if he were solving a puzzle that had already revealed most of its pieces. Jason looked toward him. If these reports continue, we may have to suspend routing assignments until the system is reviewed. Several supervisors immediately reacted. Suspend operations? One asked. We cannot do that. Another manager shook his head. Do you realize how many shipments are moving through the network right now? Jason understood their concerns. The numbers were enormous. Every hour of downtime would carry significant financial consequences. Yet the alternative was becoming increasingly dangerous. Marcus stepped forward and pointed toward the display. The system is still generating new conflicts. Jason followed his gaze. Another series of assignments had just shifted into overlapping schedules. Emily stared at the screen. It is getting worse. Marcus nodded. Because the algorithm still believes it is making correct decisions. Jason rubbed his forehead. If we stop operations, corporate leadership will demand immediate justification. Marcus looked at him calmly. Then give them one. The room fell silent. Jason understood exactly what Marcus meant. The data itself was the justification. Every report, every conflict, every alert. The evidence was already there. The challenge was convincing leadership to act before the consequences multiplied further. Jason opened a conference call with regional operations leaders. Within minutes, voices filled the room through a speaker system. Managers from multiple facilities reported similar findings. Delayed processing, conflicting assignments, unexpected bottlenecks. The pattern was undeniable. One manager asked the question everyone was thinking. Who first identified the issue? Jason looked across the room toward Marcus. Emily followed his gaze. Several supervisors did the same. Marcus simply stood there quietly. Jason hesitated before answering. A visitor noticed inconsistencies in the routing data. The response created immediate confusion. A visitor? Someone asked. What kind of visitor? Jason glanced at Marcus again. That is not important right now. Yet inside the room, people were already wondering. Emily remembered the moment she had mistaken him for ground staff. The memory now felt increasingly uncomfortable. Another manager spoke through the conference call. We need a recommendation immediately. Continue operations or suspend routing assignments. The room became completely silent. Every eye turned toward Jason. He was responsible for the facility. The decision belonged to him. Jason looked at the display. More alerts appeared. More conflicts emerged. Then he looked at Marcus. What would you do? Several supervisors seemed surprised by the question. Marcus considered the situation carefully. If the data is trustworthy, continuing operations creates additional risk every minute. Jason nodded slowly. So your recommendation is suspension. Marcus met his eyes. My recommendation is protecting the network before the problem becomes larger than the solution. The words hung in the air. Nobody immediately responded. Then another alert appeared on the screen. And another. Jason finally made his decision. He reached for his phone and prepared to contact executive leadership. Because if corporate approval was required to stop the operation, that approval needed to happen now. What nobody in the room realized was that the next conversation would reveal far more than a routing failure. It would reveal exactly who Marcus Reed really was. Jason Turner stepped away from the operations display and moved toward a quieter corner of the room. Everyone watched him. Supervisors paused their conversations. Employees pretended to focus on work while secretly listening. The decision now rested with executive leadership. Jason initiated the call and waited. The room remained silent except for the distant sounds of loading equipment outside. Emily Parker stood near Marcus Reed, no longer viewing him as an interruption. The confidence she once carried had been replaced by uncertainty. She still did not know who he was, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He understood the crisis before anyone else in the building. After several moments, the call connected. A senior executive appeared on the large conference display mounted above the operations floor. Jason, the executive said immediately, we are already receiving reports from multiple hubs. Tell me what is happening. Jason took a breath and summarized everything. The routing conflicts, the overlapping schedules, the expanding impact across the network. As he spoke, the executive's expression grew more serious. Finally, the executive asked the question everyone expected. Who identified the issue first? Jason glanced across the room. Every eye followed his gaze toward Marcus. A visitor currently on site. The executive frowned. A visitor? Yes. Put him on the screen. The request immediately created a wave of confusion throughout the room. Jason looked toward Marcus. Would you mind? Marcus nodded and stepped forward. Emily watched closely. The executive on the screen studied Marcus for a moment. Then everything changed. The man's eyes widened. He sat forward in his chair. Marcus. Complete silence swept through the operations center. Marcus smiled politely. Good afternoon, Daniel. Several supervisors exchanged confused looks. Emily felt her heart sink. The executive actually knew him. Not only knew him, he sounded surprised and concerned. Why are you at the Atlanta facility? Daniel asked. Marcus folded his hands calmly. I was conducting an independent review. The room became even quieter. Daniel shook his head slowly. Nobody told me you were visiting today. That was intentional, Marcus replied. Jason stared at him. Emily stared at him. Everyone stared at him. The conversation clearly belonged between people operating at a completely different level of authority. Daniel looked directly at Jason. Do you understand who you are speaking with? Jason hesitated. Apparently not. Daniel almost laughed despite the situation. That is Marcus Reed. Silence. Then more silence. Jason blinked. Emily felt her stomach drop. Several supervisors exchanged stunned looks. Daniel continued. Marcus Reed founded the consulting group that designed our logistics modernization strategy. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily felt the memory of every earlier assumption replaying in her mind. Ground staff. Human resources. Unauthorized visitor. The words now sounded unbelievable. Daniel was not finished. His firm has advised transportation networks across the country. He looked directly at Marcus. If Marcus is recommending a suspension, I want to know why. Suddenly the room understood. The stranger standing quietly near the display was not merely knowledgeable. He was one of the people responsible for shaping the systems they depended on. Jason looked at Marcus with entirely new eyes. You built portions of the framework we use? Marcus smiled. Several years ago. Emily lowered her gaze. The realization hit harder than she expected. While she had been questioning whether Marcus belonged in the operations center, he had probably forgotten more about logistics than most people in the building would ever learn. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. Marcus, what is your recommendation? Marcus looked toward the display showing the growing stream of conflicts. Then he answered calmly. Suspend routing operations immediately. Investigate the deployment. Prevent additional damage before the system creates larger failures. Daniel nodded without hesitation. Understood. Then he looked toward Jason. Begin preparing for a network-wide operational pause. The room froze. Because in that moment, everyone realized that the man they had mistaken for ordinary ground staff had just influenced a decision powerful enough to affect the entire operation. The operations center remained frozen for several seconds after Daniel's announcement. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. The only sounds came from the constant movement of equipment outside the building and the occasional notification tone from incoming system alerts. Marcus Reed stood exactly where he had been standing all afternoon. Nothing about his posture changed. Nothing about his expression changed. Yet everything around him had changed. Jason Turner looked at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and respect. You designed parts of the framework? Marcus smiled modestly. A team designed it. I happened to lead the project. Emily Parker remained silent. The realization was difficult to process. Earlier that day, she had assumed Marcus belonged with the ground crew. She had questioned his presence. She had tried to redirect him away from operations. Now she was learning that the man she dismissed understood the network at a level few people ever would. Daniel's voice returned through the conference display. The executive committee is already reviewing emergency procedures. He looked directly at Marcus. Based on your recommendation, we are initiating a controlled network suspension. Several supervisors exchanged stunned looks. A controlled suspension of operations was one of the most significant actions the company could take. It affected facilities across multiple states. It affected schedules, transportation contracts, customer commitments, and thousands of shipments. Daniel continued. The objective is simple. Stop the spread of the routing conflict before additional damage occurs. Jason immediately began coordinating with regional managers. Calls were placed. Instructions were issued. Departments moved into emergency response procedures. Throughout the facility, screens began displaying updated operational directives. Employees noticed the changes almost immediately. Questions spread across loading zones. Supervisors gathered teams. Aircraft schedules were reviewed. Processing queues were frozen. For the first time that day, the entire network was slowing down. Marcus watched the response unfold without celebration. He understood the cost of the decision. A shutdown was never a victory. It was a safeguard, a difficult choice made to prevent a larger problem. Emily finally found the courage to speak. You knew all of this when you arrived? Marcus looked toward her. Not all of it, but you suspected something. He nodded. The numbers felt wrong. Emily shook her head slowly. And you saw it in less than 30 minutes. Marcus smiled. Sometimes experience helps. Jason overheard the exchange and laughed softly. That may be the understatement of the year. Around the room, employees continued coordinating the suspension. Reports arrived from other hubs confirming that the operational pause was already preventing additional routing conflicts. The decision was working. Daniel received updates in real time and relayed them through the conference call. Conflict generation is slowing. Another update arrived. Several facilities have already isolated the deployment issue. Then another. Analytics confirms the shutdown prevented further network contamination. Relief spread through the room. The crisis was not over, but the worst-case scenario had been avoided. Jason looked toward Marcus. You probably saved this company a fortune today. Marcus shook his head. The data saved the company. Jason smiled. Only because someone listened to it. The statement lingered in the air. Emily lowered her eyes again. She understood exactly what he meant. All afternoon, the evidence had been visible. The problem was not hidden. The challenge had been convincing people to notice it. Daniel's voice interrupted the silence. Marcus, the executive committee would like you to join a review meeting later this evening. Marcus nodded. Of course. Daniel smiled. And thank you. The conference call ended. The screen went dark. Yet the room remained filled with a different kind of awareness. Employees no longer saw Marcus as a visitor. They no longer saw him as an outsider. They saw him as the person whose judgment had stopped a growing operational disaster. And for Emily Parker, the realization carried an even deeper lesson. The most important person in the building had been standing in front of her from the very beginning. She simply never bothered to see him. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the atmosphere inside the Atlanta facility felt completely different from the one Marcus Reed had encountered when he first arrived. The urgency of the crisis remained, but something else had replaced the assumptions that once filled the operations center. Respect. Employees moved through their responsibilities with renewed focus as technical teams worked to isolate the faulty deployment. Reports continued arriving from facilities across the network. Each update confirmed the same conclusion. The operational pause had prevented a much larger failure. Millions of dollars in potential disruptions had been avoided. Jason Turner stood near the operations display reviewing the latest status reports when he noticed Marcus preparing to leave. "You are heading out?" Jason asked. Marcus nodded. "My work here is finished." Jason laughed softly. "I think most people would disagree with that." Marcus smiled. "The important work belongs to the teams fixing the problem." Emily Parker approached cautiously. Throughout the afternoon, she had replayed every interaction in her mind. The memory of her first words to Marcus remained impossible to ignore. She stopped a few feet away and looked directly at him. "Before you go, there is something I need to say." Marcus turned toward her. The operations center grew quieter. Several nearby employees listened without pretending otherwise. Emily took a breath. "When you arrived this morning, I decided who you were before I learned anything about you." Marcus remained silent. "I believed I understood your role. I believed I understood why you were there. And I never stopped to consider that I might be wrong." Her voice was steady, but sincere. "I was focused on appearances instead of information." Marcus nodded slowly. Emily continued. "I am embarrassed by that. And I am sorry." The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Marcus smiled gently. "Thank you." Emily shook her head. "You could have corrected me immediately." "I could have," Marcus agreed. "Why did you not?" Marcus looked around the operations center. Employees monitored systems. Supervisors coordinated responses. Technical teams worked through reports. Then he looked back at Emily. Because the problem was more important than the misunderstanding. The answer settled over the room. Jason smiled quietly. The response sounded exactly like the man they had come to know throughout the day. Emily nodded. "I understand." Marcus adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave. Then Jason asked one final question. "After everything that happened today, what lesson would you want people here to remember?" Marcus paused for a moment. The room became completely silent again. Then he answered, "Never confuse confidence with certainty." Several employees exchanged thoughtful looks. Marcus continued, "The moment we believe we already know everything about a person, a situation, or a problem, we stop paying attention." Nobody spoke. The lesson felt larger than the events of the day. The data was always there, Marcus said. The warning signs were visible. The truth was available. But people were looking at the wrong things. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. She understood. Jason understood. Everyone understood. Marcus smiled one final time. "Respect people before you know their title. Listen before you assume. And pay attention to what is actually in front of you." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit. Employees watched him leave. Not because of his reputation. Not because of his influence. But because of the example he had set. Earlier that day, many of them saw a stranger they thought they understood. By the end of the afternoon, they had discovered how wrong they were. Outside, the sun was beginning to set beyond the runway and cargo ramps. Inside, the facility continued recovering from the crisis Marcus had helped prevent. The routing system would be repaired. The operations network would return to normal. The reports would eventually be archived. Yet one thing would remain long after the technical problem was forgotten. The lesson that the most valuable person in the room is not always the one people expect. And that true leadership does not announce itself. It reveals itself through wisdom, patience, and the courage to see what others overlook.